Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our program today with the European Union endorsed the Brexit agreement. The EU has sealed a divorce deal with Britain after 2-year marathon negotiation. It is left to the UK Prime Minister Theresa May to sell that agreement back at home, which is no easy task. Despite the deal, uncertainty remains over the fate of Brexit. Let's take a look.
A moment of deep sadness. Words from the head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, to describe the mood in Brussels as European Union leaders formally agreed on a Brexit deal on Sunday. Many shared the somber sentiment.
It is tragic that Great Britain is leaving the EU after 45 years, but we naturally have to respect the vote of the British people.
In contrast to her sentimental EU counterparts, the British Prime Minister chose to drum up optimism for her audience at home.
Do you share this sadness?
Well, no, but I recognise that others do.
Theresa May described the deal reached on Sunday to be in Britain's national interest.
First, control of our borders. Second, control of our money. Third, control over our laws.
It was a major progress in the painstaking and often confusing process of just exactly how Britain would depart from the EU, which is set to take place at 11 p.m. UK time on March 29, 2019. A key feature of the withdrawal agreement is to keep open Britain's border with Ireland. The 27 EU leaders took barely half an hour to rubber stamp a 600-page treaty setting the terms of Brexit and a 26-page declaration outlining a future relationship. The next step is for Mrs. May to pass the deal in the deeply divided British Parliament. The vote is due to take place before Christmas. The complexity of the issue is reflected by opposition to the deal by both Brexit supporters and opponents. Those who wish to remain in the EU want no exit at all, and Brexiteers think the deal leaves too many loose ends. EU leaders warned British lawmakers on Sunday not to dream of a better bargain.
This is the best deal possible for Britain. This is the best deal possible for Europe. This is the only deal possible.
The pound has strengthened since the deal came together over the past 10 days, but companies and investors remain jittery. The Brexit Pact will allow the British government to dismantle its current laws while negotiating a new relationship with Brussels. European officials have restated time after time that while the UK is leaving the EU, it is still part of Europe.
We will remain friends until the end of days.
Though what comes next remains to be seen, leaders are indeed looking at the future of relations between Britain and the EU with optimism.
The Brexit summit, to be or not to be, is it still the question? For some answers, with us in our Beijing studio, Cui Hongjian, who's the director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. In London, we invited Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Darendorf Forum of London School of Economics and Political Science. In Rome, Francesco Sisci, an Italian author and columnist who's currently a senior researcher at Renmin University. Last but not least, in Miami, Remy Piet, who is a research fellow at the University of Miami European Union Center. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start with you, Mr. Begg, about that. The deal apparently has become some kind of a deal. The question is whether the deal will be approved by the Parliament. That is still a big question mark.
It is indeed, and the deal that's been approved is one part of a sequence of deals. It's about how the UK leaves the European Union, which is why the emphasis has been on things like the border controls, the divorce payment that the UK will make, and settling the Irish border problem. Now, what happens next is we have to think about the future relationship. The deal that Theresa May is trying to get past the Parliament, which you can see behind me here, is one which approves the withdrawal deal only. It doesn't commit to the future deal. And I think she's going to have a very great difficulty because on her own side of Parliament, Conservative MPs, maybe a quarter of them are opposed to the deal. if the Labour opposition votes solidly to oppose her, then she will lose, and this is going to throw the UK into constitutional turmoil.
Well, we'll see what's going to happen. Some say for now the UK Parliament will unlikely to approve the deal, and then Downing Street has 21 days to put forward a new plan or a no-deal scenario comes into play. To avoid that, both sides may decide to renegotiate the terms of the bill. At the same time, the Labour Party will likely push for a general election. Campaigners for a second referendum on Brexit would also likely intensify efforts to secure a new public vote. Mr. Cui, here in Beijing, of course, that means another start of another long march.
Yes, exactly. Yes, as we know, I think so far, anyway, this kind of draft of the agreement will be, I think, a very progress, especially if we look back into this very difficult negotiation. And also, I think now, I hope that it will be a new period for this negotiation, for the relations between UK and the EU, to keep the rational, feeling and judgment to dominate the whole process of Brexit. Not just later emotional, to dominate something.
Right. Mr. Xixi, is it a more rational agreement you see between the UK and the EU reached so far?
Well, it's, I don't know how can we define rational or irrational. Definitely there is no quarrel, and this is already a great achievement, as at a certain point it was looking like there would be a hard Brexit, so a really quarrelsome result. However, I agree that the big question mark is not the present agreement, but what kind of relationship will UK have with Europe, and what kind of relationship, I would say, UK would have with the rest of the world. Because it's not just Europe, it's the rest of the world. The rest of the world is moving in a direction more toward Europe and less interested in a UK which is isolated.
Okay.
That, I think, puts UK on a difficult footing.
I see. Mr. Piet, of course, you are based in Miami. Is that true? The rest of the world is moving much toward the EU rather than the UK.
Well, simply the size of the European market and the interest for other countries and companies worldwide is larger than the size of the British market. So obviously, if you have to choose into signing a specific deal with a larger European Union of 27 or 28 countries and signing instead a legal agreement with the UK, you're obviously going to be, pushing towards signing an agreement with the European Union. What's important here is to see that right now we have a deal on the divorce between the UK and the European Union, which is the first time that happens in history and shows other countries that would be willing potentially in the future to leave the European Union, that it's not an easy process. And we're not talking anymore about other potential other exit from other countries, because they realize that you cannot decide to be outside of the European Union with your own control over a series of laws and still having access to the single market. You have to be actually abiding to a series of agreements from the European Union and become some kind of a satellite of the European Union if you want to do this. And that's the criticism from the hard Brexiters on this.
But Professor Begg, if you look at it, 100 billion pound for that divorce deal is not that necessarily much of money. And meanwhile, it might take a few years for the UK to so-called divorce the EU, and yet a few years, if you compared it to a few decades, it's not that long a time. Is what Mr. Piet really saying earlier likely to be the lesson, or rather an interesting experience for the other economies within the EU if they want to renegotiate their terms?
Well, first, if you allow me to correct you, Wei, the divorce bill is £40 billion approximately, not 100, so it's a bit less dramatic than you implied. However, what's very clear is that the EU side has been anxious to ensure that the UK does not get a deal that encourages others to leave, and that's very much transpired in what's come out. But also from the British perspective, what you see when you look at this is that it satisfies neither side. The hard Brexiteers wanted to leave the EU comprehensively. Those who wanted to remain want to stay in. Instead, what Theresa May's deal is giving them is something stuck in the middle, if you like, grey instead of black or white. And the problem here is that nobody on the British side really likes Theresa May's deal, which is the main reason it's not going to have a very easy passage in Parliament. That will also have repercussions for any other country which thinks about doing the same kind of thing, because they'll say, Britain is losing from this. Why would we, as a rational country elsewhere, think that we can be better off outside the EU when we see the damage it's doing to Britain, both in political terms and eventually in economic terms?
Right. Eventually, economic terms, probably that is the most important thing, isn't it? After all, the EU-wide countries gather together to have that body is having a lot to do with the single market. 46% of trade that the UK is likely to lose with the EU by the year 2030. Professor Begg, I want to have your British view once again. What would that mean for the economy, and how are people thinking about that, even with this temporary deal?
Well, there are several dimensions to it. First, we don't lose all trade with the EU after Brexit, because it will depend on the future relationship. And even if some of it at the margin is lost, the EU would still remain Britain's biggest trading partner. However, the projections that have come out from different economists across the spectrum in the UK suggest that there are losses compared with what would otherwise happen to British GDP. By 2030, let's say, it could be 2, 5, 8% lower than it would otherwise be. Now that's not a fall in GDP, it's not a recession, but it's getting more prosperous more slowly than it would otherwise be the case.
But on the other hand, Mr. Piet, when the UK, which is one of the arguments for leaving the EU, is having this Brexit secured once they did that, that would mean it would also have the freedom to renegotiate its terms with the other economies, the United States included. We do not want to forget that the current administration is pretty much a supporter of the Brexit possibility in Washington. So will the UK, as a result of that, gain benefits elsewhere? Do we know much about those possibilities?
Well, that was the main argument from the ard Brexiters, saying that by moving away from the European Union, the UK would be able to develop specific trade relationship with India, the United States, Australia, and that would be in benefit of the UK. In truth, when you actually look at hard numbers, and I absolutely agree with my the other one that actually talked just before me, the potential gain from the UK on those marginal trade deals are calculated up to 0.6 to 0.7% of GDP compared to an average loss of 5% if you move away from the European Union. So basically, in basis of pure economics, the potential is simply not there, because you actually also would benefit from clear, maybe better trade agreements if you negotiate as part of the European Union. The European Union does have agreement with Canada, does have a new agreement that is about to be signed very soon with the Mercosur in Latin America. So it's not by just moving away from the EU that you actually open up new trade roads. It's just a different way of negotiating, and the actual gain is marginal compared to what you would have by staying within the EU. And the negotiation with the EU are only starting right now. There's a series of disagreement coming on fishing, on other sectors that would be interesting to follow.
Mr. Shishi, shutting off the UK, will the EU have more freedom also as a result of this? Well, after all, the UK has put in a lot of their own conditions when the EU was trying to negotiate things with the others.
I don't know if it will have more freedom. It would have more clout. Definitely, after this agreement, the EU is much stronger. If they manage to push, let's put it bluntly, the UK out of the Union on its own terms, as it's clear, as some other of your guests have already underlined, it will be much harder for any other country to move out of the Union and to get a good deal out of it. So definitely the EU is stronger. However, it's not clear what the EU will do with such new strength, because there is a lot of talk about a renegotiation of the union, reform of the union, but we see little of it. And part of the problem here, let's be also frank, is that the EU has not reformed fast enough and well enough to accommodate a different world. This is the other side of this deal, I'm afraid, too.
I'm afraid that is true. On the other hand, Mr. Cui, you see Germany, the UK, France, and some of the others are playing some pivotal roles within the EU earlier, and now with the UK leaving, obviously the geopolitical balance within the EU has also been changing. What would that mean?
Yes, I think firstly, I think the Brexit, I mean the lift of the UK on all means, which means, I mean, the weaken of the European Union. If we look at the GDP, I mean the whole volume of GDP of the EU, it lost a part of a big part of the UK, and also especially on the political diplomacy and the security field, we can also find out this very obvious loss from the European Union. But of course, just like our European guest mentioned, that perhaps they will give some some new dynamic for European integration. But now the question is, how could France and Germany, they can take some more responsibilities? Now the big question for this, for example, this common security and foreign policy. Right. Also, we know in the past, UK and France, they can take some more responsibility because both of them are a member of the permanent council in UN, but not Germany. Right. So I think now it will give some maybe a weaken for this we call it the power balance within European Union. That is extremely interesting, isn't it, Mr. Piet? If you think about Macron, the French president, was the one that proposed there has to be an EU army to defend the EU against what they consider as the threat to the interests of the EU, including possibly the United States. So now Germany, of course, after the Second World War, is having a very different attitude toward the world and how its defense should be like. And what it should be involved. So are we going to see two very diverse directions of major opinions among some of the major countries now within the EU after the UK leaves, if it does?
Well, yes, indeed. Independently of the issue of Brexit, the key topic can also be the future of the European Union, further integration, reforms of different institutions, democratic life inside the EU. And what's very fascinating and interesting is that the calendar here is quite unique, because we're about to open a new period of European elections for the vote of the European Parliament next year. So all these debates of the future of the European Union are on the table today and will be the key topics of discussion for the next 6 months. You have a vision from Macron that is actually very ambitious, trying to strengthen and move forward towards more of a political union, which is the origin of the union. I mean, let's not forget that it was not meant to be an economic union in 1949 with the Schuman Declaration. It was a political union to move away from the Second World War, and then it got drifted towards more of an economic project, and that's the perspective from the French, which the Germans are slightly starting to embrace. I mean, even the security issue is slightly different compared to because of history, and you also have more of an economic perspective seen by the Eastern European countries, with other countries also at the table having different divergence. The Italian, more than anything, have more of immigration security concerns to the European Union. So all these questions, those issues are going to be on the table for the debates for the coming month. Right.
Bad news, bad news, bad news, Mr. Xi, I have to say, because when the EU and the UK are struggling with this Brexit thing, the world is changing so fast and everything is fluid these days. G20 summit coming up, nobody knows what's going to happen between China and the United States, not to mention the international governance system. So, Mr. Xi, what would this mean, this acts and actions mean for the EU and the UK deal?
Well, tension, and this tension will weigh in a lot in the next few months. In the short term, I think it is a win for the traditional parties. And this is good news. I mean, the traditional parties in Germany and France can say to the new populists, you see, you can trust us, we can stop our enemies, so to speak. We can guarantee stability. So this could help stem this wide wave of populism in France and in Germany, which is mounting and is definitely very dangerous.
All right.
However, we have to see after, and this is good news, after March, we have to see how this deal will be panned out and what will actually happen in the European elections in May.
Right.
What kind of wave of populists we'll have. So we shall see. But good and bad, I would say.
Oh, I love your optimism, Professor Begg. Before we go.
Do you want me to be optimistic?
Oh, whatever. I wouldn't put words into your mouth, sir.
But the one potential direction for optimism is that there is the possibility of a reconsideration of the whole question of Brexit inside the UK. Because if Parliament, as we discussed earlier, is unable to make a decision on it, it may eventually have to go back to the people in a second referendum. Now that in itself is extremely complicated constitutionally, because it requires Parliament to vote for having a second referendum. And at the moment, the disarray in Parliament doesn't enable us to have any kind of majority on anything.
Oh.
However, once you bring in the people, you may say the only way to conclude this is to bring back the people a second time and give them another vote. And there is a growing clamour inside the UK for that second vote to take place. It would disrupt the timetable enormously, because it would take a minimum of 5 months to organise a second referendum, and that would be beyond the 29th March date.
One can tell, Professor Begg, you love the world when it's more than complicated. Thank you so much for the four of you for being with us. For now, Ian Begg, Francesco Sisi, Remy Piet, last but not least, Cui Hongjian. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.